good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody who is joining our conversation today. We're really excited to have you here to share some findings from some really interesting research that our colleagues at Decodis and MSC have spearheaded with the support of CGAP over the past year that really looks at how financial services, the role that financial services can play in helping people respond to climate shocks and stresses, and the importance of context as we approach this conversation. My name is Wendy Chamberlin. I wear a few different hats. I was part of the CGAP research team that was helping to lead this effort. This effort was instrumental in forming CGAP's strategic approach on climate resilience and adaptation and looking at the role that financial services can play. We really felt it critical to take a demand side view of how do people experience climate shocks and stresses, and what do they have to say about those events and the impact on their lives, and how are they leveraging financial services to support their efforts. I also represent Busara, which is a behavioral science research firm where we're looking at the role of how behavioral science can support people's efforts around climate adaptation and resilience. This event is being recorded, so we will have it available afterwards. And my colleagues from Decodis and MSC will be sharing some resources in the chat. If you're on this conversation, you're likely either interested in climate, inclusive finance, or something of the two coming together. And if you have research you want to share with us and insights, please take advantage of the chat to share those, because we would be glad to learn from you as well, because we are all very much in a learning journey on this process. Here's how today's conversation is going to go. We're going to share with you some preliminary findings, and then we're going to have a conversation that will open up for a discussion. And so it'll be really fun to see where this takes us, and also just to hear from you as well. I would like to get started by introducing my colleague, Daryl Collins, who some of you may already be familiar with. Daryl is the founder and CEO of Decodis, which is a social research firm. She is the author of Portfolio of the Poor, and she is a pioneer working at the intersection of finance and human vulnerability. In the past 2 decades, she has built a broad portfolio of work with foundations, bilateral donors, governments, NGOs, and private service providers. Her work is grounded in a deep understanding of the lives of vulnerable communities across the globe, leveraging the experience of executing financial diary studies in over 10 countries. And not to give it away, but I think you'll see some elements of that work in what Daryl shows shortly. Before founding Decodis, Daryl spent 10 years as managing director and subsequently CEO of Bankable Frontier Associates. She holds a BSc and an MSc in economics from the London School of Economics and a PhD from NYU. And she's currently based in Massachusetts. So Daryl, we're going to turn it over to you to share with us some of the preliminary findings from this research. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Wendy, and thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Let me quickly go through some of what we found, and then we want to invite our panelists to really think through what this all means. As Wendy mentioned, we underwent this work in a quest to understand how households deal with climate-related weather events, and particularly through the lens of their finances. So we were looking at people's experiences, and then we were looking at the lens of money. And I've changed the title of some of this feedback of what I'm going to be talking about today to really coping, resilience, or adaptation, because that's really where we have landed in the thrust of this work. So as Wendy mentioned, we owe a debt to CGAP, who supported this work. We, at this point, have really sort of pulled through the analysis for this particular webinar, but have also been publishing some results on landing pages on both for Decodis and MSC's websites. This study was looking at 2 different places, and keep in mind that these areas they range in some of the worst hit areas for climate-related weather, severe weather, in the north of Nigeria, and then in the Kulima region of Bangladesh. And we were looking at both quantitative and qualitative research to get some of the sense of the numbers and the size of impacts, as well as looking at different types of populations. And overall, looking at about 500 between the two methodologies. So cutting to the chase, a lot of what we found is in the qualitative research, we went way back and looked at 30 years before households had really come to the specific weather events that we were looking at. And we saw along different realms of different space of development, sort of an asset deterioration in property, deterioration in nutrition, deterioration in terms of any sort of financial gains, and any sustainability of income. Now, after this particular weather event, we found that only 10% were sort of coming out of it and sort of breaking and arresting that downward decline of household assets. But about 60% kept going. So we need to ask ourselves, what is resilience and what is coping? Because that 60%, they didn't necessarily deteriorate faster. 30% did, but 60% recovered to that same decline. So is that really coping? We kind of wonder about that, and that's the question that we want to put forward to this audience. Now, we found that in Nigeria, we were looking in particular at 2021, where there were some rains that came very, very late, much later than expected. They were supposed to come in the first 3 months of the year. They only came at the end of June. And then following that drought period came sudden and intense rains. And we looked at a period where this is particularly severe in northern Nigeria in 2021. So if we look at money and how money was used in financial strategies, in this particular situation, most of them were used during that drought period. And then by the time the intense rains had come along, a lot of those financial strategies had been used up. So these were things like borrowing to plant new cassava plants, or trying to draw on savings to hire people to do some manual work to try to manage the water. By the time you had intense rains, a lot of those financing strategies had been used up, and there wasn't as much money to deal with the type of implications or actions you need to take with intense rains. Now, the types of financial strategies that people used look very, very similar to what we find for low-income households in general, like the people that we would see who are responding to financial diaries. Different types of strategies like savings from a savings group. This is an informal instrument, but incredibly important to all low-income communities around the world. It was especially important to these communities in Nigeria, borrowing from those same savings groups. Saving in a bank didn't show up quite as much, but it was certainly there within these populations. They would sell assets. Now, is that a financial instrument? In my view, it is, because you can save in a physical asset. You can save in a goat, and you can liquidate a goat and get money that you can then use for other things. Selling assets was very, very common in Nigeria in this particular time and among these particular populations. So, but these are the types of strategies that most low-income households would use. And in Bangladesh, again, there were sort of, we were looking at the typhoon, the cyclone Amphan, and that was around 2020. And again, we saw different phases of that event. There was a preparation phase where very little was done. Very little people sort of prepared financially for this cyclone. And it will become more clear why as we go through the implications financially of what people work with when they face this type of weather event. When the cyclone happened, that happens very quickly. The flood and the aftermath is one type of event. where people were trying to get their hands on money to buy food and medicine. And then where most financial strategies came in is in the recovery phase. And so very different events have very different distribution of where the financial strategies are used the most. But like in Nigeria, they use the same types of strategies as low-income households in general. They were selling assets. They were borrowing from microfinance institutions. They were borrowing from relatives, borrowing from money lenders. And what's interesting in Bangladesh is that people used many more different types of strategies than they did in Nigeria. They borrow from 2 different microfinance institutions. They'd borrow from 2 different relatives, and then they borrow from a money lender. So they tended to layer strategies on top of each other and not necessarily have one of each strategy the way they did in Nigeria. But again, the point here is that this doesn't look terribly different. These are the same types of strategies that are used by low-income households around the world, even those who are not dealing with a weather crisis at that moment. But what's different? And the way that we ended up explaining to ourselves what is different here? Why is it that we're not just saying, well, people need to manage their money as they always need to manage their money? They need different types of savings. They need different ways to get money quickly. Yes, that's absolutely true. But through the lens of money, we see that things are actually quite different. And we created the stylized model based on some of the results of the quantitative survey. So this is looking at what happens to the balance sheet of households when you first find that first cyclone Amphan. Well, we found out that people sort of put themselves in the hole, so to speak. They took on debt, they used savings, and they liquidated assets to the tune of $420 per family. Now, when you have that type of asset depletion, that means for the next climate event, it's hard to take on new borrowing because you haven't paid back the old. You don't have ready savings to use, and you don't have as many physical assets to sell. So we look at that as a negative asset through which we're thinking about how do people climb themselves out of that hole. Well, if we stylize this and think about simulating how people would use their income just to start to climb out of that hole, we can estimate that households have about 140, based on our surveys and based on national surveys as well, that households have about 140 USD per month. And that's income that can be used for all of the household needs. But based on some of our financial diaries research, we could say, okay, 10% of that income could be used for asset recovery. In other words, paying back debt, recouping savings, and buying back assets so there's preparation for the next event. And so you see here, after that first month of Amphan, if income goes back to normal and following the stylized model, you start to see the asset depletion reverse. So if we run forward and we think of when we get to 2021, before the next event, there are 2 other factors that we need to consider. On the one hand, we know that there are regular remittances coming into these households in Kulima from various different places where their relatives have migrated. So small regular remittances are helping recover those assets. However, during this time period, since Amphan, prices have increased about 25%. It's been a time of very, very high inflation following COVID. That has deteriorated the purchasing power of income, and it's made it harder to get out of this asset hole. So we have 2 different things happening. So in the next cyclone, which happened nearly a year after Amphan, we see that households then go back into the hole of asset depletion. Following that, they had almost reached a point where they had recovered all their assets, but then they go right back into the hole. The next cyclone, again, we see an asset depletion again. Now that happened only 5 months afterwards. And we see that they barely had gotten like halfway out of the hole before they went right back in. And then in the latest cyclone in this time series last year, we went nearly up to recovering because they had 20 months to do so. But once again, they were coming back into this state of asset depletion. So it's against that state that we really need to be looking at households. We need to ask ourselves, just as we did in the chart that I showed earlier, is this coping? Maybe. But it certainly isn't resilience, and it's nowhere near adaptation. So very eager to start this conversation. There is so much we don't know about how this plays out in different contexts and different types of events, as well as when there's different types of solutions and infrastructure already at play. So let me hand back to you, Wendy.
Thanks so much, Daryl. And I'm about to introduce our panelists, but it's so interesting because I was just looking at some recent FinScope data from Kenya. It tells the same story. You know, we're coming to some points I think that resonate with a lot of us who have been in the financial inclusion space for a while, but this need to look at this differently really matters as well. So to take the conversation in that direction, we have 2 panelists we'd like to introduce that we're going to have a small bit of conversation with. The chat's going to be open for you to put in questions that can relate to what Daryl has just shared, that can relate to the topic overall, that can relate to what comes out in the upcoming conversation. But first, joining us, we have Dr. Fazlel Rabbi and Dr. Katharine Vincent. So Dr. Fazlel Rabbi, he has a PhD from the University of Aberdeen on environment science and has published many articles and books on credit. He has worked as a director for climate change and international convention in the Department of Environment, and is a director in the Bangladesh Climate Change Trust and an advisor to the Green Climate Fund of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He is authority on climate finance and was the key resource person for the Green Climate Fund accreditation of PKSF and Adaptation Fund accreditation of PKSF. He is working as a member of the official Bangladesh delegation on the UNFCCC negotiation from 2009 to up to now, and he leads the finance team in the negotiation of the UNFCCC both for Bangladesh as well as for other LDCs. He is a member of the consultative group of experts from the LDC group under the UNFCCC. And then Dr. Katharine Vincent, she's the director of Kulima Integrated Development Solutions. And she's a visiting research fellow at the Global Change Institute at Wits University in Joburg. She conducts applied adaptation research with particular interest in political economy, adaptation decision-making, and co-production of actionable knowledge to promote effective and equitable adaptation in the Global South. She has contributed to the IPCC 4th, 5th, and 6th assessment reports and the special report on land. She also does technical consulting and has worked in over 20 countries in Africa and Asia to design, obtain climate finance for, implement, monitor, and evaluate adaptation projects. So Dr. Rabbi and Dr. Vincent, thank you so much for joining our conversation today. I want to be mindful that our audience may be, again, coming from this topic from various different angles. So we'll turn it over to you, but just take time to also maybe explain some terms in case some are more or less familiar with them. And let me just start off with a few different questions. And you're welcome to turn on your cameras as well for this part of this discussion, unless the network is a little bit fuzzy. But let's just start with what Daryl has shared with us, and both this notion that people are just coping. We're not seeing them move towards resilience. And in some cases, if another shock or stress hits, be it climate related, be it pandemic related, be it economic related, we're going to see people doing less than coping. Tell us how this speaks to your work, given the fact that you represent sort of different perspectives. And Dr. Fazlel, maybe I'll start, or Dr. Rabbi, maybe I'll start with you on that, please. How does this work speak to what you do? Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you to introduce me among the participants, and thank you other panelists and distinguished participants and guests. In fact, you know, Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable country according to German Watch data from 2000, I think, 9 to 19. It is the 7th most climate vulnerable country. Actually, you know, the disaster, climate-linked disaster is very prevalent. In the last cyclone, what happened in the last 27th May, in fact. Another around 50 people died, thousands of livestock, crops lost, and migrated around a few 100,000 people migrated just last May. It is very much prevalent. And the question is that what we are doing for these people. This is a big question. Actually, in some areas, the people are living in Bangladesh. They are actually, the people should not live there. Why they are living there? In the chor areas, in the cyclone-prone coastal areas. They're living because they don't have any alternate. That is not habitable, in fact. But they are staying there because government does not have enough capacity to migrate them in a safe place, and they don't have themselves the capacity to migrate by themselves to any other place. So they're living there, very vulnerable. I visited the country level in the chor areas, and I asked a point. I found the people in the vulnerable area, they changed their shelter, home, 7 to 20 times in their lifetime. That means every alternate day through 3 years, they change their shelter because due to flood, due to disaster, cyclone, this and that. Government actually doing, as you know, Bangladesh is LDC. We have a lot of other challenges, development challenges, as well as to address the poverty issue, food security issue, communication, health, education issue. Right now, actually, we have Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief. We have Department of Disaster Management. For the long before, for example, 100 years, we are taking care of the disaster-prone areas and people. Post-disaster, particularly. After the disaster, we provide some food or some emergency support to them. It's very minimum. It's very ad hoc. But we have, for the last few years, we have, to some extent, smart early warning system, particularly on cyclone. So we can provide them the early warning so that people can go to the cyclone shelter before it has happened. And it actually drastically reduce the death of the people. But for livestock, crop, actually, we did not do anything, not too much. But after disaster or before disaster, after the loss, actually, government as well as private organization, NGOs, they are doing very little compared to their need. We have strong safety net program covering around 10 million people. But that is very minimum. For example, a widow, a disabled, they are getting around $5 to $10 per month. That is the amount. So safety net. And we have some safety net program for climate vulnerable areas. Those are vulnerable, but again, the amount is very minimum. And gradually we are trying to support them after disaster to some extent bigger amount, but actually if we compare the need, actually it is not enough at all. Regarding insurance, actually right now for climate vulnerable population, there is no insurance mechanism because it's so much challenging. It's a premium, it is getting insurer, reinsurer, and getting database, supporting and technical support, administrative cost, lot of things. But for the last 10 years, some companies, even government, government insurance company trying to make some kind of insurance mechanism, but still it is on pilot basis or to some extent in very rudimentary stage to make it bigger or effective in the climate vulnerable risk. In concrete, I can say that climate vulnerable people in our country, they are on the kindness of God. The government, NGOs, they are doing something, but compared to their need, it's very minimum. And still we don't have enough facility or enough support for them, even in the coming near future. But for early warning system, other system, we can provide some kind of early warning system, and we are providing some kind of drill to the people so that they can escape from the cyclone, flood, this and that. Government is trying to make some kind of loss and damage mechanism for the last 2 years. Again, it is very challenging. I think from government, NGOs, and from international support, we can make some kind of safety net or some kind of database so that we can provide support to them. I think it is very necessity, because if we can say, we usually say it's human rights or rights for the vulnerable people, rights for the disaster-prone people, rights of the every people of the world. We are seriously ignoring the basic human rights of the climate rights. Very significant. They don't, during disaster or after, they don't have food, water, sanitation, even security. So all of this, I think this is the pressing need. And one thing I should say, because they are in the remote areas, they are not enough educated, they don't have any pressure group, they don't have any organization. So they cannot raise their voice even to the government properly, even internationally. So they are, because I'm working in an organization, it's called Palli. Palli means rural. I visited frequently in rural areas. I see they're too disastrous, but their voice is not heard by us, even the government and international community. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Rabbi. And points well noted about the differential between program design and what's delivered and what that really means in terms of addressing what people need to have as a result of their exposure. Dr. Vincent, I'd be curious about how these findings speak to your work and your experience. Thanks.
Thanks. And yeah, it's interesting because I'm working in a totally different geographical location to Dr. Rabbi, but lots of the same kind of situations. And of course, it has a lot of resonance with what Daryl has presented. I mean, I think what this study has shown is that we've got sort of direct empirical evidence for something that I'm seeing on a daily basis in Southern Africa, where I'm mainly working, which is that there's never enough time to recover from exposure to a climate hazard and get back to where you were, let alone being able to reduce your vulnerability to future exposure, which is what we would typically think of as adaptation. And if we combine that with what we're seeing in terms of increasing frequency of exposure to climate extremes and increasing magnitude of those extreme events, we've got this compound situation of asset erosion, which also erodes adaptive capacity and sets us up for bigger problems in the future. And these findings show just how serious this issue is. And if I compare this with my own work situation at the moment, in Southern Africa last year, the El Nino event that we had globally brought drier than average conditions to my region, which it typically does. And a number of countries, among them Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, have all declared states of disaster as a result of the drought. And in both Malawi and Zambia, which are countries that I work frequently in, nearly half of each country's staple maize crop has basically failed, which has affected 6 million people in Zambia and 4 million people in Malawi. And that's between 20 and 30% of the population who are now in situations of dire food insecurity. And if we think about where we are in the current time of the year in June, at the moment, all of those people, largely in rural areas, would be eating what they had grown in the last year. But since they didn't get a harvest, they're not able to do that, which means that they're either reliant on assistance, which is rarely sufficient to meet needs, as we've just heard similarly in Bangladesh, or being forced to erode their own financial capital by selling assets and so on, and sometimes engaging in very harmful other strategies in a desperate mean to survive. And then what's going to happen later this year, when they need to plant again for the next rainy season, they won't have the seeds to plant nor the means to purchase those seeds. And add to that, we've got a high likelihood that there'll be exposure to climate hazards and extreme events next year as well. I mean, in Malawi, for example, national states of disaster have been declared for floods or droughts in 6 of the 9 last years. And one of those years was a COVID year as well. So that was a disaster for an entirely different reason. So what we formerly had as unusual circumstances is fast becoming the new norm. And I think this raises lots of important questions about what we do to support adaptation and whether we should be expanding our focus in how we support adaptation. In the Global South context, already at household level, a lot of my work is trying to focus on promoting behavioural changes that don't necessarily have input costs, because of course many people can't afford input costs where they would be required. So things like, for example, shifting your planting dates, changing where you plant if that's an option, improving soil moisture management and things like this. But many household adaptation actions also do require funds, and that's where the limitations of financial strategies come in. Personally, at the moment, I'm working on a couple of different climate services projects where we're trying to produce and effectively communicate weather information and early warnings so that people can make informed decisions about how they manage their activities, which is particularly relevant for farmers. And I've been told by many farmers that if they know what conditions to expect, there are things that they can do differently in order to try and reduce their risk. But I've similarly been told by many others that you cannot eat information, which was actually the title of a paper written by one of my BITS colleagues, of course, highlighting that, you know, even if you know what conditions that we're likely to expect, if you don't have the means available to do what you would want to do in order to reduce your risk, then that's not particularly helpful. So I think we need to be cognizant of the reality that we can't really be expecting lots of active adaptation against this backdrop of asset depletion unless there are actual strategies in place to support that. And that brings me to another point, which is the issue of sort of adaptation spaces in which we operate and tricky questions relating to the limits to adaptation. Because there are many cases where adaptations of a particular type are not going to be successful, and therefore we really need a step change in what we're promoting. So for example, in agriculture, we're seeing changes in crop suitability ranges as a result of changing climate conditions. And that might mean that the best adaptation response option is not to try and maintain the production of one crop, even if that's the crop that's been traditionally grown, but rather to shift to a different crop entirely. And then there are other cases where even that's not enough and even bigger shifts are required. For example, it might be out of agriculture entirely, and there are increasingly places which are not becoming suitable for crop production in particular. We're also at the moment seeing increasing incidences of maladaptation, and those are often caused where attempts at adaptation have proved to be unsuccessful. And that's also highlighting that these limits are in place. And I think we need to have much more discussion on what these limits are, which ones are movable and which ones are not, and for whom and in what circumstances, so that when we are making decisions around supporting adaptation at a variety of levels, from sort of like international through to local, so that we can be ensured basically that the selections that we're supporting are more likely to be effective. I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm going to point out the obvious. You know, one of the things from the development side that we like to do, we like things that are linear, left to right. This thing started here. People dealt with it here. It ended here. No one's talking about that story. Daryl didn't present that data. Dr. Rabbi didn't present that data, and Dr. Vincent, you haven't presented that data either. What we are showing is that this is like an ongoing type of risk exposure, which means that, you know, the way we respond typically in the inclusive finance space is say, what's the solution? What's that product? What's that set of products? And in some ways it means we need a new toolkit, not that we're going to like overhaul inclusive finance per se, but we have to think about the role of financial services. I have a question and then I'll turn it over to the audience, and we have one question that's come in. We should have more. There's 62 of you, so please put questions in the Q&A. But where do we go from here? We have this information that tells us people are not getting enough resources to even just get by before the next shock comes. And we can't, and the problem is we can't predict when the next shock is going to come. We also have information that says there are similarities in what people in different contexts are experiencing, but the differences also matter. And that throws a wrench into our toolkit that we can't actually use because we're used to generalizing solutions. So what should we do next as practitioners as we think about this work and trying to work towards beyond coping and moving towards adaptation and resilience? Dr. Rabbi, I wonder if you have a perspective on this, and then I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Vincent, and then we'll go to a question or two from the audience. But what do you think, Dr. Rabbi? What should we do next with this kind of information?
Yeah, thank you for a very pertinent question. In fact, as I said before, the poor people, vulnerable, living in such an area that is not in fact habitable. First question, they should not live there. They are living there because they don't have alternate. So government, I think, might be with the international support, should make a program so that the vulnerable people, they are frequently devastated by the increasing and intensified disaster, particularly climate change disaster. All the disaster in Bangladesh actually linked with climate change. So the government should have program with the support of international community, international support to relocate them in a safe place first. Second, actually, government should try to make some very real database. It is a very difficult task because people are migrating by their own every time, and they are living particularly in the coastal or in the shore areas. That is not their own land. They don't have any kind of right on that land. It is government land, this and that. Making them in the books of the government is another difficult task, in fact. But still, government need to make some kind of database of the vulnerable people so that on regular basis, actually, they have a shortage of livelihood as well in normal time. And in the disaster time, they have less livelihood for long time. So if they can make database, and after analyzing the database, government can have some kind of programs for their asset development, for their shelter, for their sanitation, this and that. It's a might be short, medium, long term, but it needs huge amount of financial support. That is the challenge. Number two. Number three, actually, I think from international level, there might be some mechanism so that the climate vulnerable countries could get some kind of support from international sources. And in international level, it's frequently talking about we are insurance mechanism. But to make insurance mechanism, we need insurer, reinsurer, and premium support. For in that case, I think both national and international partners could work together so that we can make some kind of insurance mechanism in the preliminary stage, maybe in small scale. But in the larger scale, it might be possible if we get support from every sphere of the from the country as well as from international community as well as UN agencies, UNFCCC and others. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Vincent, over to you. What do you think we should do next?
Thanks. Well, I mean, I'm clearly coming at this very much from a sort of climate adaptation and resilience perspective. And what I think is really fascinating is the detail that this adds to the sort of the financial capital as a sphere, which we speak about from an adaptation resilience perspective. But at least in my own experience, I haven't had much opportunity to delve into the specifics of that. And what this study highlights is just how much nuance and diversity there is that we need to look at. So I'm actually really keen to hear from folks who are on the call who are working in financial services to see what these findings might mean for offerings around microfinance and other financial products, because as we've seen, the range of financial strategies employed is very diverse. Dr. Rabbi has mentioned insurance, and also in Southern Africa, insurance has been promoted, I would say, fairly heavily as part of the suite of disaster risk reduction options, both at sovereign level through the likes of Africa Risk Capacity, but also at household and individual level through various index insurance schemes. Of course, as with everything, these have their pros and their cons. I have a particular concern about the promotion of insurance among people who are not familiar with the insurance mechanism. Not least because I fear it runs the risk of creating reliance on something which is highly likely to become commercially unviable in many circumstances, and therefore we potentially run the risk of sort of promoting insurance as an option that people should be using for adaptation, and then that no longer becoming available, at which point it would become a maladaptation. But in terms of sort of financial services offerings, as I say, I'm certainly no expert in this sphere, but it does suggest to me that we maybe need to be thinking in a more nuanced way about the range of offerings that exist, and perhaps the targeting of those offerings at different stages in the cycle, bearing in mind this sort of sequential process of asset erosion. The other thing which comes to mind is, and again, as Dr. Rabbi has mentioned, sort of social protection programs and cash transfer schemes have gained in popularity, and adaptive social protection programs have also become more popular, whereby those mechanisms are used to try and cushion the shocks caused by climate extremes, whether through horizontal or vertical transfers. I think that the sheer extent of asset erosion that this research has shown highlights just how important those schemes are and are going to continue to be, and probably the need is going to constantly be bigger than what's available. But I'd be interested to hear from those working in the financial services sector if they have any thoughts on what the role would be in those kind of schemes, whether there are sort of public-private partnerships that could sort of fill that part of the need. But I think the key thing that we need to bear in mind is, that diversity. You know, that as always, there's no one silver bullet, and we need to be thinking differently. And I think it's important to keep the adaptation and resilience community and the financial services sector speaking together, because it's only by bringing those two communities together that some of these nuances can be addressed. Thanks.
It strikes me too that from both what you're saying, Dr. Vincent and Dr. Rabbi, you know, we like to stay in our corners. We like to get enough information to be dangerous and then go back to our corners and run with it. And instead, we probably need to stay in conversations that have diverse stakeholders from public sector, private sector, including the climate sector and the financial inclusion sectors, et cetera, and communities as well, to really pressure test what is working and what is not, and where there are gaps. We have a number of questions that have come up, and I'm gonna take a look here. So one is, I think, going to be for you, Dr. Rabbi, specific to Bangladesh, but I think it's actually also applicable more broadly too. Why are this comes from Samvit. Why are financial services for climate adaptation pilots not scaling in Bangladesh? what challenges need to be addressed in order to scale these solutions? I think it'd be interesting actually to hear about this, both in the context of Bangladesh, but also, Dr. Vincent, what you're seeing in Southern Africa as well, to the extent that you're aware too. But Dr. Rabbi, what do you think are some of the barriers for scaling these climate adaptation pilots?
Yeah, thank you. For example, regarding your question, actually, Bangladesh already prepared this national adaptation plan. It's up to 2050, and we said we need around 230 billion up to 20. In a year, it needs around 9 billion USD. And in that document, it said government hardly could manage 2.5 to 3 billion, and the gap is 6 billion per year. Even you see the UNEP report on adaptation gap report, they said around globally, the adaptation gap is around 300 billion per year. So we are LDC, we are vulnerable. As I said, we have other emergency works for food security, poverty eradication, health, education, this and that. So government maximum could provide up to 3 billion. Rest of the money we should generate, but it cannot. That is that. And you see the international financial structure and finance flow for climate. It's so negligible. It cannot help actually. Even 5% of our need cannot be met by the international financing. And again, the quality of international financing, it might be create another debt problem, because maximum international financing is loan. And some of the, although they are saying it climate finance, but some of them are loan in market rate. So practically it is not helping, or particularly on climate change adaptation. It might be helpful on climate change mitigation, but adaptation from international source, particularly on MDBs, Material Development World Bank, this and that, it is not helpful for addressing the adaptation issues. So it is big challenge actually. Government does not have enough money. There is not enough quality money from international sources. So the people's the vulnerable are actually in a true sense ignored. And I would like to highlight one question. You said maladaptation. Question is not that maladaptation. Actually, when disaster comes, people should survive by that. They are surviving by themselves. They are getting very minimum support from external sources. So they are survive for the time being. It might be a maladaptation, but we are not helping them. But after the survival, then we are saying that it is maladaptation. But what we are doing? We are doing nothing for them, almost nothing. So they are doing by their own, whatever they think it is fit for them. For example, in chore areas, they try to raise their plane, their house, so that they cannot be under flood for every year. But what happened when they raise their plane? Sometimes the communication system disrupted. There is water stagnation, some disease outbreak. This happens. You can say it maladaptation. But we are not providing them technical support, financial support, nothing. We are doing something, but compared to need, it is peanut. So lots of issues. And another issue it is raised, the migration. Internal migration is very prevalent in coastal and the flood-prone areas. 6 to 8 months, people internally migrate, particularly for their livelihood support, because they don't have support for 6 to 8 months of a year. So normally they migrate. The women and children are in their ancestral home, but the workforce, the men of the people, normally they migrate for a major portion of the year to earn something, to earn their livelihood. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Rabbi. Before I go to you, Dr. Vincent, I'm going to go to Daryl, who wanted to make a couple comments too. Daryl, over to you.
Oh, I just wanted to chime in briefly as I'm listening to Dr. Rabbi and listening to Dr. Vincent and seeing some of the comments. I think what is really important to realize from this research is that people are not just sort of sitting inert, waiting for something to happen. Like all low-income households with their money, they're very active, they're borrowing, they're doing whatever they can. all of the different financial strategies that I showed you are homegrown. It's not led by a scheme. It's not something that somebody has come along to try with them. It's savings groups, which people have always done and do all the time. It's homegrown, it's active, it's anything but inert. And people are really, whatever they're doing for themselves. As Dr. Rabbi said, what we're doing for them is peanuts. And what's important is compared to what they're doing for themselves. So if we see this asset depletion of 420 USD per household per event, they're handling that all themselves. That is all they're borrowing. There's no collateral behind it. There's no somebody coming in with a cash transfer. So I think that's really important to sort of contrast that people are already very, very active in their own financial worlds trying to cope. And because they're financially active, what we found in financial inclusion is to build on what they already know. We know how to digitalize savings groups. We know how to facilitate smooth and safe transfers. And so there isn't, as Wendy said, not one product, but a range of products, but also building on what people are already doing and helping to fill in those gaps. So I just wanted to chime in here, but interested to see how the other comments are coming in.
Thanks so much, Daryl. Dr. Vincent, I don't know if you had a reaction as well to the question or even comments being made.
Yeah, maybe just briefly to say, I think this question of scale is key, because I fully agree that, you know, what everyone is doing is the best they can for survival. But what I think is a pity is that the structures that could be changed to make the likelihood of that survival better, to make it easier and to make it more enabling of adaptation, at the moment, that is not what's taking place. And that's what I think we should be focusing our attention on, so that people can continue to do the best that they can, but without, you know, constantly having that erosion of their assets, you know, and the struggle that that results from that. And I think, you know, in the same sort of way, the question of scale is key in terms of what we need to do. I mean, the last IPCC assessment report basically highlighted that we have this rapidly closing window of opportunity to act, and we are just not acting fast enough. And that's the key. We need to ramp up our ambition and our speed of action and our scale of action, because otherwise these circumstances are just going to continue. And the people, as you've outlined in your study, Daryl, are going to continue struggling and struggling and struggling. And you know, that's not acceptable. We can and we must do better than that, I think. Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks so much. I note that we are going to be close to time, and I want to turn it back over to Daryl. Just a few things that come out just really quickly, Lou. Business as usual is important for us to reflect on in terms of what we have in our toolkit, but we need to recognize our toolkit is not doing enough at the same time. And part of that toolkit needs to include what are people already doing to get by, and how can products and services complement those efforts potentially, and how do we have to take into consideration context? And there's a lot of richness behind what people are saying, and I know this is also coming up in some of the questions. I know we're not getting at all the questions, and I'm sorry we don't have more time for that. So colleagues, Dr. Rabbi and Dr. Vincent, please take note of them. Also, if you have links you want to share with the folks who are joining this conversation, please put it in there as well. But Daryl, maybe I'll just turn it over to you. We could end here and be very dissatisfied and say, oh, there's no more to talk about, but we have so much more to talk about. What are you thinking of next with this work, especially with colleagues at Microsave and also with your own work? And maybe then you can just wrap us up. Thank you.
I mean, I think that part of what we saw coming out of this work was really, and again, Dr. Rabbi, you're hearing this from him, is a sense of desperation. Put into the sort of cold hard truth of balance sheets and income statements and cash flow statements. This is a situation that me, as a researcher of how low income people manage their money, see as something that is just not sustainable. In development, as we think about how people get out of poverty, there's time. And we don't see nearly as much as these populations things like selling assets. I'm used to people selling assets when things get really tight or really bad. Whereas selling assets are a continuous theme of these populations. And so therefore, it just seems to me that financial services absolutely will not do this alone. Cash transfers need to be at least some part of this situation. And where we could be focusing our financial solutions on is the management of those cash transfers. So I think I want to end on that note from us, but we're very, very happy to continue to engage. Again, these particular areas are some of the most worst hit. What do we say when we go into contexts that are not quite as bad, or that are just beginning to see some of the types of effects that these households are seeing? Our solution might be completely different. So I do think that this conversation is just starting. And hopefully as a financial inclusion community, we can really bring some of what we've learned over the past decades into this conversation to provide our own contributions. So thank you very, very much for everyone for attending. Please do follow us. We've put up all of our social media, our landing pages. Please do get in touch because we really do want to continue to have this conversation. I want to thank both of our panelists, Dr. Rabbi and Dr. Vincent, very, very much for participating and providing your perspectives on this conversation. And Wendy, thank you so much for such wonderful moderation. And again, I want to thank MSC for being wonderful research partners and thought partners on this topic. Thank you so much, everyone.